It's been a sweltering summer. Excessive heat waves with no end in sight have swept across much of the country. In fact, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that June was the hottest month ever in the U.S. since record-taking began 141 years ago. July also topped the charts as the hottest month ever on the planet. Travel to the western region of the country and several states are still dealing with scorching temperatures, persistent droughts, and a brutal wildfire season that's just getting underway. For the more than 32 million people who make a living working outside, this shifting climate isn't just a nuisance, but is life-threatening. Each year, more than 65,000 people visit the emergency room for heat-related issues, and about 700 die from heat, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
When a person is exposed to extreme heat, they might start to feel nauseous or dizzy or start to feel other signs of dehydration. And if they're not able to access shade or drinking water, those symptoms can progress into increasingly severe heat-related illness.
That's Dr. Rachel Licker, a senior climate scientist with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. The UCS is a national nonprofit organization based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Licker notes that the majority of people who work outside for long periods of time are in low-wage positions in agriculture, construction, and food service. This can mean picking bushels of berries out in the fields or pushing an ice cream cart down a beach for hours on end with little rest or shade. In the U.S., the laborers that fill these jobs are disproportionately people of color, immigrants, or undocumented migrants who have limited work options.
The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, requires that employers provide a safe work environment, but there are no specific measures that employers are required to follow to keep workers safe in the face of extreme heat. And when you couple that with the reality of our work structures and, for example, farm workers are oftentimes paid for what they produce and what they pick. So there are perverse incentives for these workers to continue working in the face of extreme heat. And, we don't have mandatory measures on the books that can guarantee these workers their wages, even if they're not able to work because it's not safe. And we also hear instances in which workers will request breaks, request access to shade and drinking water, and they're not afforded what they need to keep safe. And that's why we have injuries and death on the job still in 2021 in the United States.
OSHA reported that between 1992 and 2017, 815 workers died from heat-related injuries, and more than 70,000 were injured due to heat exhaustion on the job.
Sometimes the protective gear that workers need to wear to stay safe from other hazards like sun exposure or even pesticides for farm workers require that they wear clothing that can exacerbate heat illness. And so it's certainly a complex issue. But, again, illnesses, these are deaths, injuries that are preventable. And, workers should not be put in a position of having to choose between their health and a paycheck. They should be able to take the breaks that they need. They should be able to not work and when it's unsafe and be compensated for their time so that they're not losing out. Just like for any other industry, where we get sick days, we get days off when it wouldn't be safe to work.
Researchers at the Union of Concerned Scientists predict that between now and 2065, climate change is set to quadruple outdoor workers' exposure to extreme heat, leading to even more injuries, deaths, and billions lost in earnings. One person that's advocating for the rights of these workers in the legal landscape is Kate Sussman, an attorney at the Northwest Workers' Justice Project in Oregon. In her day-to-day, she represents laborers in low-wage jobs who have been taken advantage of.
We hear from workers that shade is sometimes hard to find. There are certain crops, you can imagine, like blueberries or crops that are low ground, where there's really just not shade. We also know from last summer, when we had really terrible wildfires that encroached on some of the metro areas, like Portland and Salem, Oregon, there was an expectation that workers would show up to work. Yet, these were so smoky, you couldn't see, a couple blocks down the road from my personal experience in Portland. So workers were having to show up in really thick smoke. There was also active COVID outbreaks going on, and heat could be a factor too.
Right now, there are no federal standards safeguarding people who work in hot environments. Instead, legislation varies from state to state. Many states don't have any kind of heat-related protections. For the handful that do, Sussman says it's still a work in progress to tighten these guidelines.
One thing that for me is really important is that the high heat threshold is lower here than it is in other states. So at 90 degrees, workers have added protections. And Oregon is a state that historically has not seen these high heat events, the heat dome that we've been experiencing in much of the farming community. Workers, they understand that there are risks to it. In Oregon, that's a newer reality. So we're pleased that starting at 80 degrees, there's one set of protections, and then at 90 degrees, there's an added level of protection.
Working outside in hot conditions is physically taxing and takes a heavy toll on the human body. Sussman says that the life expectancy of the average farm worker is decades less because of the grueling manual tasks and long hours. Just this summer alone, Sussman says 5 workers in Oregon died due to heat-related injuries.
Heat is one of those things where we all learn to look at it like, well, this is just a part of life. It's not so dangerous. It actually is really dangerous, and we need to have a whole lot more education for employers and supervisors, as well as workers, around what does high heat exhaustion look like, what are the things you can do to protect yourself, and to make sure that workers know that heat isn't just an inconvenience, it can actually cause you to be seriously ill, or it can be fatal.
However, it's hard to advocate for yourself if you're feeling sick, if it means losing out on money. That's why activists like Sussman are fighting to keep workers whole and provide paid compensation. In addition, they're also working with employers to rethink the traditional 9-to-5 schedule.
We have seen some employers in Oregon, some farm employers, offer workers to start much earlier before the sun comes up. A friend of mine who's a farm worker was even offered to work overnight in the fields. So some employers are taking it upon themselves to adjust shifts and to offer workers flexibility. But that's really an individual determination of an employer at this point. So we're hoping that when we get a strong, permanent rule on heat and on smoke, that we have options for workers and that we follow the best science around occupational safety and health.
In coming years, this problem is only set to get worse across much of the U.S. as heat waves intensify. It's important to create stricter legislation now, before more lives are lost.
We also very much want to stress that this is a story relevant to all of us. This is relevant to the people who employ outdoor workers, because if it's too hot to work, that's going to have an effect on their bottom line. This is also relevant to all of us who depend on outdoor workers because they are typically essential workers. We can't have a world without them in which, don't have people able to work on farms or respond to emergencies or build our homes. So, if an outdoor worker isn't able to work, it has ramifications for all of us.
To find out more about this topic, our guests, Dr. Rachel Licker and Kate Sussman, as well as links to resources, visit viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
Colleges and universities are trying to return to normalcy this fall. But with students living and learning in close quarters again, and the Delta variant running rampant, the risk of exposure to COVID-19 is increasing. 18 to 24-year-olds have the lowest vaccination rate of all eligible age groups in the U.S., and most universities are not requiring students to be vaccinated. Erica Hirsch is Vice President and General Manager of Asymptomatic Testing Solutions at Thermo Fisher Scientific.
Breakthrough infections among the vaccinated continue to occur, resulting in further viral spread and putting people at risk. This means that monitoring of community infection rates and frequent testing of all students, regardless of their vaccination status or expression of symptoms, will be imperative in providing proactive responses to any potential outbreaks at colleges and universities.
Some prominent universities in the U.S. are already mandating regular testing of all students. Find out more at thermofisher.com/COVID testing for college.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
It does have this reputation or image as being a relatively harmless condition.
The perception versus the reality of living with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Then,
you will see people who are not of the particular race and ethnic background being cast in those roles.
We explore the darker history of opera. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.